As a kid, I remember having to wake up early with my siblings during the last days in June each year to pick fresh peas in our family garden near Salt Lake City, Utah. Like most kids on summer vacation, I resented having to wake up early, but my mom forced us out of bed before it got too hot outside to do anything, which is why I think the memory is so vivid. I still give my parents grief for all the work they made us kids do growing up, citing child labor laws as grounds for abuse and suggesting they should pay for any counseling I might need to process the trauma. But the truth is, like most adults who grew up on farming or gardening households, I now cherish the memories of working in the garden, especially eating the sun-ripened fruits and vegetables. On the menu for those bright and early summer days was creamed peas and potatoes, one of the earliest garden-based meals of the year. The recipe calls for a large bowl of fresh garden peas, several pounds of young red potatoes, a few small onions, and milk with salt and pepper to taste. I say recipe, but the meal was and is always an approximation. Mom never follows a recipe when making creamed peas and potatoes. It is just something she does. She learned it from her mom growing up in southwestern Idaho, who learned it from her mom growing up in western Montana. The dish's formal history in my family ends there, because my grandmothers have since passed away and I didn't think to ask them how far back this meal actually goes. For all I know, it may have been a favored dish among my ancestors as far back as they were growing peas, potatoes, onions, and milk together. Whatever its history, apparently part of the unwritten process of the meal was rising before the sun, because we always seemed to get out before breakfast to harvest the meal before it got too hot. Bent over the tangled bush of vines, my siblings and I would begin filling our brown paper bags as we worked down the rows. The ache in my back and the cramp in my legs was the most discouraging aspect of the work, but it was also a fun treasure hunt-like experience, and we always compared bags after we were done to see who got the most. After we finished with the peas, Mom had me and my older brother dig some young potatoes and grab a few onions as well before we went in for breakfast. That evening, after we'd shelled the peas and scrubbed the potatoes, Mom served the stew-like meal with toast. With the first bite of starchy potatoes, with fresh peas that popped in our mouths, we knew summer had officially begun. Hi, my name is Ross Garner, and you're listening to a Food for Each Season podcast. As the title suggests, I'm interested in the seasonality of food. That is to say, I'm interested in when people eat certain foods and why. Whether it is roasted turkey, stuffing, and cranberry sauce in November, or watermelon and hot dogs in July, we all associate certain foods with specific times of the year. This podcast will explore the histories of those seasonal foods and try to identify their meanings. This episode, entitled Creamed Peas and Potatoes, takes a look at a dish my family loves and only eats during the first beginning weeks of summer. But before we delve into that dish, and because this is my first episode, let me set some groundwork in regards to the seasonality of food. What do I mean by seasonal food? Certainly my answer to this question includes room for things like cranberry sauce for Thanksgiving and watermelon on the 4th of July, as special foods play a major role in how our culture celebrates holidays. But how did these foods become associated with these holidays in the first place? Well, one answer is simply because November and July are the natural harvesting times for cranberries and watermelons respectively, at least in North America. Therefore, my definition of seasonal food goes beyond formal holiday fare to include meals that mark the calendar in more informal ways, like my family's creamed peas and potatoes. Being locally based and subject to the restraints of natural growing seasons, these foods might be less pervasive culturally, but I argue that they are still significant to understanding of people's values and deserve our attention. Partially because we live in a world with such globally interconnected foodways, where you can have bananas in the desert or green salad in the middle of a snowstorm, I'm interested in what foods maintain a seasonal integrity, that are only consumed during clearly defined times of the year. As such, my definition of seasonal food also prefers local food. It might always be banana season somewhere in the world, but just because you can ship a banana from the Bahamas to Utah in the fruit's ripening period doesn't make it a very seasonal food in my estimation. However, I am not a seasonal food purist and am not too proud to examine interesting anomalies, like a desert-based banana bread, eaten in spring because of a seasonal bumper crop of bananas in the tropics. Transnational seasonal foods deserve some attention too. Thus, to summarize, my definition of seasonal food is food consumed only during specific times of the year, and preferably grown or produced locally during the food's natural growing season. Now to return to my family's recipe. Like I said, creamed peas and potatoes is sort of a family heirloom, but I know we can't be the only people eating the dish over 4 generations. So I did some basic internet searching to see who else eats the meal and what their stories are like. My Google search produced over 2 million hits, with recipes as similar and diverse as you might expect, considering Google's global network. For example, the Taste of Home website had all the major ingredients my mom includes, but with formal measurements, like 2.5 cups peas and 1 pound small red potatoes. It also included a 1/4 cup of flour to help thicken the otherwise soupy meal, whereas my mom would sometimes use cornstarch and water, or simply cut back on the milk. Like my experience, the cook of this online recipe cites her childhood, picking peas in June with her mom and the delicious meal that grew out of the garden, as the source of this recipe. Another cook, whose recipe had different proportions of everything, but with the same basic ingredients, cited a farmer she purchased the vegetables from at a farmer's market, as the source and inspiration of her version. With so many origin stories, creamed peas and potatoes is more a relic of folklore than history. Looking further at the variability and diversity of the recipes, I noticed a low-fat creamed peas and potatoes from Homemaking Divas, slow cooker creamed peas and potatoes with ham from Little Dairy on the Prairie, and creamy Parmesan potatoes and peas from Butter with a side of bread. Some made health claims with small nutritional essays preceding the recipe, and others followed the modern fad of defining themselves by what is not in them, like gluten-free creamed peas and potatoes. I also saw versions made completely or partially with processed and preserved versions of the foods rather than fresh ingredients, recommending pearl onions, frozen peas, or dehydrated potatoes, which made me begin questioning the generally held seasonality of the dish. But one aspect many of the recipes shared in common was an emphasis on the agricultural act of picking peas. While potatoes and onions have equally interesting growth cycles, nutritional advantages, and environmental histories, peas stand out in my family's narrative as well as in those of others for several reasons. First, peas are generally the most palatable vegetable of the 3 in its raw form, making them a more enjoyable item to harvest, as you can eat as you pick. Second, peas are generally the first and most demanding of the vegetables to mature and require harvesting. And third, peas provide the contrasting color of the dish, as the white, fleshed potatoes and onions melt together in the milk. But whatever the true reason for their prominence in my family's culture and that of others as well, I'm going to focus on the history of peas rather than the potatoes or onions. According to George Madeljohn, a biochemist, certified French chef, and authority on food history and nutrition, peas date as far back as biblical times, with archaeological findings in Egyptian tombs. But it was not until tender varieties were developed in the 16th century that cream peas were popularized by the French King Louis XIV. According to another food historian, Marika Takanishi-Knowles, peas were so popular in France during this time, Parisian goldsmiths were known throughout Europe for a decorative motif called the Cossé des Pois, or pea pod. Knowles notes how this design for ornament was based on the representation of the garden pea, Pisum sativum, which was a common staple of the French diet, and one of the oldest cultivated crops on the planet. However, the pea's prominence in French cuisine and culture did not make it an untouchable holy cow in European culture, especially for the German-speaking Austrian neighbors. In the 19th century, Austrian monk and scientist Gregor Mendel published a brief article on his compelling experiments on peas. In this article, Mendel identified the novel concept that individual heritable units of a plant control specific traits, meaning a careful gardener who controlled the pollination of different types of peas could control the type of plant next year's seeds would produce. Mendel likely used peas in his experiments because they are a relatively easy plant to grow, as well as control in their pollination cycles. By artificially inseminating a pea with the pollen of another plant with desirable attributes, like a bigger pea or resilience to heat, Mendel essentially became the first plant pimp as he dictated the sex life of the pea. According to biologist and science historian Norman F. Whedon, Mendel's ideas have now become the basis of diploid transmission genetics, and most introductory genetics textbooks refer to him as the father of genetics. So you can thank or hate the pea and Gregor Mendel for modern hybrid crops and genetically modified organisms. Based on Mendel's work in pea sex, plant breeders have developed the pea into three main varieties: garden peas, snow peas, and sugar snap peas. Garden peas are the kind my family grows and are prized for the meaty pea seeds inside the pods. Snow peas don't develop substantial pea seeds and are meant to be eaten pod and all, as used in stir-fries or on salads. Sugar snap peas are a hybrid between garden and snow peas, with meaty peas and less fibrous pods. However, garden peas are the most nutritionally dense of the three varieties, and are best cooked al dente, according to George Madeljohn, the chef and nutrition expert, or just long enough to soften their cellulose and hemicellulose fibers, making them easier to digest and firm enough to pop in your mouth. Following the chef's advice intuitively, my mom adds the peas towards the end of the cooking process when making creamed peas and potatoes. After boiling the potatoes and onions together in water, my mom adds the peas for about 3 minutes. She then pours off most of the starchy water, leaving some in the bottom of the pot to keep the dish moist and save on milk. She smashes a couple of the potatoes to thicken the dish, and then adds enough milk to fill the space between peas and potatoes. She then warms the milk and adds salt, pepper, and butter, and sometimes garlic powder to taste. The result is garden-based comfort food at its finest. Of course, the fresh, delicate taste of the young vegetables is the main reason why my family eats this dish seasonally. We could eat it any other time of the year, as we freeze our excess peas and always have a cellar full of potatoes and onions. But it is difficult to quantify or describe the quality of peas hand-picked for ripeness and potatoes whose skins have not yet matured and toughened in spring. Unlike most store-bought peas that are often too big and meaty because they are allowed to get overripe to make mass harvesting methods more efficient, peas picked by hand can be selected for ripeness. The same goes for potatoes. Generally sold by the pound, it makes more sense to allow potatoes to grow to maturity and harvest them in October or November in Utah and Idaho, when there is some more substance to them. The trade-off is a tougher skin. However, if you grow your own garden in your backyard, you can harvest them at the most desirable stage. My parents, who have grown their own garden for 27 years and have taken the liberty to sample their own produce at all stages of development, generally conclude that most supermarket vegetables are overripe. Corroborating my family's experience, one study performed by the University of Plymouth in the United Kingdom concluded that the principal reason for consuming seasonal food among consumers is taste and freshness. When shopping, consumers are predominantly using seasonality as a quality criterion, and for the most part it proves a useful rule of thumb. However, other research shows a more complex view of the nutritional quality of seasonal food, and why people favor them. According to a study in 2016, some frozen fruits and vegetables are more nutritious than fresh ones because they are frozen soon after harvesting, thus preserving their nutrients, while the fresh ones are allowed to respire on the truck, in the market, and on your counter until you eat them. Freezing fruits and vegetables affects some more than others. peas being one of the more palatable reheated foods. But who likes to eat soggy, thawed-out strawberries more than a fresh one? Furthermore, taste and nutrition are not the only factors for consumers buying and eating seasonally. There is an environmental aspect as well. According to one seasonal food advocate, imported, overprocessed food is not only tasteless and nutritionally poor, it carries a high ecological cost, due to the petrol it took to ship it from wherever the food is in season, or other high fossil fuel costs to produce them locally in hothouses. While these may be less persuasive reasons for the average consumer, who is generally more interested in the tastiness of their next meal, these environmental concerns are growing and becoming more pervasive. As a final thought on the seasonality of food, consider the etymology of the word season. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, season dates back to the 13th century. It means the right date or appropriate time, usually made in reference to some particular operation of agriculture. It is both a noun, denoting the different times of years determined by conditions of weather and temperature, and a verb, used to describe the rendering of something more palatable, or to bring the food to maturity. As such, the natural seasons of a specific place brought natural seasonings in terms of food. Different foods ripen at different times, bringing different flavors to different times of the year. As mentioned previously, some of our biggest holidays reflect the natural seasonings of the seasons, which in my mind is a good thing, because who likes to eat the same thing all year round? Modern supermarkets and preservation techniques definitely have their benefits, providing a host of options and arguably greater access to more nutritionally balanced diet. But it also homogenizes our food cycles, making it possible to eat whatever you want, whenever you want, thereby taking the seasonality and thereby the seasoning or taste from our food. Now, I'm not suggesting anyone become a strict seasonal eater, but learning to savor watermelon during the summer rather than demand its less nutritious and petrol-laced versions during other seasons might just be more satisfying to you and your environmental conscience. What is more, you might find that half the fun of eating, like Christmas or any other major holiday, is found in the anticipation of waiting all year for it. Thanks for listening to this episode of A Food for Each Season on creamed peas and potatoes. Stay tuned for my next episode on Armenian Easter pilaf recipes, and feel free to check out the work of some of my friends and colleagues at Utah State University on related food topics on USU's Digital Commons.